October 16, 2024. A homeless teenager on a subway platform notices a well-dressed man collapse without warning and makes a split-second decision to help instead of walking away like everyone else. What she doesn't know is that this single act of compassion will set off a chain of events that exposes a decades-long conspiracy, destroys powerful people, and forces her to question everything she's been told about why she's poor in the first place. But can helping one person really be enough to change an entire rigged system? The fluorescent lights of the Atlantic Avenue subway station flickered with their usual indifference. Jasmine Brooks, 17, sat on a metal bench, her worn backpack beside her containing everything she owned: 3 changes of clothes, a pair of sneakers with holes in the soles, a journal with most of its pages filled with sketches and dreams, and exactly $12.47 in cash. She'd been homeless for 8 months, long enough to understand the rhythm of the city, the places that wouldn't chase her away, the shelter lines that moved too slowly. Long enough to know that most people's eyes just passed over her like she was part of the station's fixtures, invisible and expected. Jasmine was waiting for the Q train, planning to spend another night at the 24-hour library before heading to the women's shelter on 5th Street. It wasn't much, but it was routine. Routine was survival. The platform was moderately crowded. Commuters checked their phones, ears plugged with headphones, minds already at home or at their next destination. A few teenagers clustered near the edge. An elderly woman with shopping bags. A couple arguing quietly about whose fault the late train was. Then the doors of the end train opened on the opposite platform. David Patterson, 58, stepped out, his custom Italian suit crisp despite the humidity of the underground, his platinum Rolex catching the overhead light. He was a man who commanded attention without trying, silver-haired, sharp-jawed, the kind of face that appeared in business magazines and on the boards of major corporations. Chief Operating Officer of Meridian Financial Holdings, worth somewhere north of $800 million depending on the day's stock fluctuations. He was also having a heart attack, though he didn't know it yet. David had dismissed the chest tightness that started during his afternoon meeting as indigestion. The slight dizziness he attributed to skipping lunch. By the time he'd left his office in Midtown, he was making excuses to himself with practiced efficiency. The same efficiency that had built his career, ruthlessly cutting away anything that seemed inefficient, including his health, his family time, and his conscience. He walked across the platform toward the Q train. Jasmine noticed him because he stood out so dramatically from everyone else. The suit, the watch, the way he moved through space like he owned it. She'd learned to notice things. Noticing kept her safe. Then David's pace slowed. His hand went to his chest. Jasmine watched as his face shifted, confusion flickering across it. He looked around as if trying to orient himself. He took another step forward, then another. His knees buckled. The crowd didn't react immediately. People had learned to ignore signs of trouble in the subway. Safer that way. Someone pulled out their phone, not to help, but to record. An older man stepped back. The couple arguing stopped talking and stared. David Patterson collapsed onto the platform, his expensive body hitting concrete with a sickening thud. For exactly 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then Jasmine was on her feet. She didn't think about it, didn't weigh the risks or benefits, didn't consider that helping a stranger could get her in trouble, that this man was so far removed from her world they might as well be different species, that nobody else was helping so maybe there was a reason. She just moved. She kneeled beside him, checking for a pulse like she'd learned in a health class years ago, before everything fell apart. His pulse was there but erratic. His face was gray. His breathing was shallow. "Call 911, she shouted at the crowd. Most people stared. One teenage boy actually lowered his phone. A woman near the token booth finally pulled out her phone and started dialing. Jasmine positioned David on his side, remembering something about recovery positions. She yanked off her hoodie and placed it under his head. "Stay with me," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to him or to herself. "Just stay with me. Help is coming." His eyes fluttered. For a moment, they focused on her face. This black girl with worry creasing her forehead. This homeless teenager in a tattered shirt. This child of the invisible world. "Thank you," he managed, his voice barely audible. The sirens came within minutes. EMTs rushed down the stairs, professional and efficient. They took over, cutting away his shirt to attach defibrillator pads, barking medical jargon at each other. As they loaded him onto the stretcher, David's eyes found Jasmine again in the crowd. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice stronger now. "Jasmine," she answered. "Jasmine," he repeated, as if committing it to memory even as the oxygen mask went over his face. "Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you." Then the ambulance was gone, leaving only the residual urgency in the station and the absence of a man who'd been there seconds before. The crowd dispersed. The end train arrived. People moved on. Jasmine stood alone on the platform, still holding her backpack, no longer waiting for the Q train because the moment had shifted something fundamental in the air. Though she didn't know it yet, couldn't possibly understand that this one decision to help a stranger would set in motion a series of events that would expose the deepest corruption in her city and force her to question everything about poverty, power, and who deserved saving. She picked up her hoodie from the ground, the one she'd given to a dying man as a pillow, and put it back on. Then she caught the Q train to the library, just like she always did, completely unaware that everything had changed. Jasmine hadn't planned to visit the hospital. The thought hadn't even crossed her mind that she would or could. Hospitals were places where people like her didn't belong, where security guards watched for people who might steal, where the assumption was always that you didn't have the right to be there. But she'd made a decision. On the morning after the subway incident, she'd returned to Atlantic Avenue Station, retracing her steps like someone looking for a lost item. A transit worker had been cleaning the platform. She'd asked him if he knew which hospital they'd taken the man. He'd been kind enough to tell her. Mount Sinai on the Upper East Side. The hospital's main lobby was intimidating. Marble floors, towering ceilings, the smell of antiseptic and expensive care. Jasmine stood near the information desk for 10 minutes before approaching, terrified they'd ask her to leave, that her appearance, her tattered clothes, her unwashed hair, her visible poverty, would trigger security. The receptionist, a woman named Teresa, took one look at Jasmine and seemed to understand something without being told. She didn't ask questions. She just checked the computer and gave her the floor and room number. When Jasmine knocked on the door to room 4217, David Patterson was sitting up in bed, looking vastly better than he had on the platform. Still pale, still tethered to monitors, but alive and conscious and clearly shocked to see her. "Jasmine," he said, and his voice carried genuine recognition, as if she were an old friend rather than a stranger he'd met while dying. "You came. I wanted to make sure you were okay," she said quietly, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "I saw the ambulance take you, and I needed to know." David gestured for her to sit in the chair beside his bed. As she sat, he studied her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Not predatory, but searching, like he was trying to see something hidden beneath the surface. "The doctors say I had a massive heart attack," he said, "that I should have died on that platform. They said if I hadn't been positioned correctly, if someone hadn't called the ambulance immediately." He trailed off, then refocused on her. "That was you. You saved my life." "I just helped," Jasmine said, uncomfortable with the weight of gratitude. "Anyone would have." "No," David interrupted, his voice sharp. "They wouldn't have. I've watched people step over bodies in this city. I've been one of those people. You didn't have to stop. You chose to." They talked for hours. David asked her questions about her life, her family, how long she'd been homeless. She answered with the kind of honesty that comes from having nothing left to hide. Her mother had died of an overdose when she was 9. Her father had disappeared before that. She'd aged out of the foster system at 18 without anywhere to go. The shelter system was overwhelmed. The job market didn't want teenagers with no permanent address. David listened without interrupting, without offering platitudes or easy solutions. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "My son is your age," he finally said. 18. He's studying business at Columbia. I've been so focused on building my empire that I barely know him. He probably despises me." Jasmine didn't know what to say to that. She waited. The paramedics told me I was lucky, David continued, that I have a second chance. I keep thinking about what that means. Most people in your situation don't get second chances. Most people don't even get a first chance. On her fourth visit, David asked her a different kind of question. Do you know what company I work for? Meridian Financial Holdings, Jasmine said. She'd looked him up online at the library, trying to understand who this man was. Do you know what we do? Jasmine shook her head. David reached for the tablet on his bedside table. His doctor had cleared him to work from his hospital bed for short periods. He pulled up a document, his expression heavy with something like shame. We manage investment portfolios for the ultra-wealthy. One of our major funds is called the Metropolitan Development Fund. 4 years, we've been investing in commercial real estate projects in economically disadvantaged neighborhoods. He turned the screen toward her. We buy apartment buildings that house poor people. We raise the rent systematically, displace residents, renovate, and sell for massive profits. We've displaced over 15,000 people in the last decade. People like your family, Jasmine. People like you. Jasmine stared at the documents. Spreadsheets filled with numbers that represented human lives reduced to data. Why are you telling me this? She asked, her voice small. David set the tablet down, his eyes meeting hers with something she'd never expected to see in a rich man's gaze. Genuine remorse. Because I'm tired of not seeing, he said. And because you saw me. You saw someone in pain and you helped anyway, even though people like me have been designed to profit from people like you suffering. You didn't have to do that, but you did. He paused, then continued, I want to understand why. I want to understand how a homeless teenager has more humanity than a man worth $800 million. And I want to figure out what to do about it. Jasmine realized then that the real story wasn't about David Patterson being saved on a subway platform. That it was about her forcing him to look at something he'd spent his entire life learning not to see. The first sign that something was wrong came through David's personal assistant, Marcus, who arrived at the hospital with a folder of printouts and a deeply worried expression. We have a problem, Marcus said, handing the folder to David without a preamble. The papers were screenshots from business news sites, social media, and investment forums. The headlines made David's stomach tighten. Meridian Financial CEO's questionable hospital visitor. Who is the girl at David Patterson's bedside? Billionaire's mysterious companion raises questions. The photos accompanying the articles showed Jasmine entering and leaving the hospital. Someone had been watching. Someone had been documenting. It started this morning, Marcus explained, his voice tight. A blogger who covers financial news posted that you've been receiving regular visits from an unknown young woman. By noon, it had spread across Twitter and Reddit. By 2 p.m., financial journalists picked it up. Now it's everywhere. David scrolled through the comments with growing horror. The speculation was immediate and vicious. Why is Patterson hiding a girl in the hospital? What's the story here? Does his wife know? This smells like a scandal waiting to happen. Gold digger alert? The implications were clear, insidious, and completely false. But the internet didn't care about the truth. Cared about narrative. What about Jasmine? David asked urgently. Has anyone contacted her? Not that we know of, but it's only a matter of time. Her image is being circulated. Some people on Reddit have already dug up information about her homelessness, her foster care background. They're calling her everything from a con artist to... Marcus stopped, uncomfortable with finishing the sentence. By evening, the story had exploded beyond financial news into mainstream media. A gossip site had run a piece titled, Wealthy CEO's Secret Companion. Is there more than gratitude here? Cable news networks were debating the optics. Morning shows were planning segments. David's phone rang constantly. His ex-wife wanted to know what was happening. His son, Tyler, whom he barely spoke to, called from Colombia with concern and questions. His colleagues were messaging with worried emojis and carefully worded concern. Then his CFO, Nathaniel Torres, arrived at the hospital without an appointment. Nathaniel was precisely the kind of executive who had thrived under David's leadership for 15 years. Ruthless, pragmatic, willing to make difficult choices. He didn't sit down. He stood at the foot of David's bed like a prosecutor. "We need to address this," Nathaniel said flatly. "The board is getting calls. Investors are asking questions. Our stock is already down 3 points. People are wondering if you're fit to lead." "I'm having a heart attack, not a mental breakdown," David replied, irritation flashing. "That's not the problem," Nathaniel shot back. "The problem is optics. You know that better than anyone. A man in your position, recovering from a major health event, receiving regular visits from a young homeless girl? It doesn't look good. It looks like you're either having a midlife crisis or there's something else going on." "There is something else going on," David said. "She saved my life." "I understand," Nathaniel said, his tone suggesting he understood nothing. "Which is why you thank her privately and then maintain appropriate distance. Have your lawyers handle any gratitude you feel. Send her money through a foundation. But these visits, they need to stop, at least until this blows over." "And if they don't?" David asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then the board will likely remove you from day-to-day operations until after your recovery. For the company's stability, of course. Nothing personal." After Nathaniel left, David sat in the darkness of his hospital room, understanding for the first time what it meant to be pressured into silence. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent decades pressuring other people into silence, buying their compliance, threatening their livelihoods if they spoke up. Now the machinery of power and reputation management was turning against him. The next morning, Jasmine didn't show up for her usual visit. David waited, then called Teresa at the front desk. "She came by this morning," Teresa said quietly. "Saw something on her phone and left pretty quickly." I looked upset. David's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I'm sorry. I don't want to make things harder for you. I'm not coming back." The number was Jasmine's. She'd gotten a phone, probably from a community center, probably specifically to send him this message. David tried calling back. It went straight to voicemail. He texted, "Don't disappear. Don't let them make you disappear." But Jasmine had already learned the most important lesson of being poor. Sometimes the safest choice is to be invisible. David sat in his hospital bed, surrounded by monitors tracking his damaged heart, and realized something had shifted. The story was no longer about gratitude. It had become about something far more dangerous. The question of what happens when someone with wealth and power chooses to see someone the system had decided should remain invisible. And powerful people were already moving to make sure that vision stopped. David had been discharged from the hospital with strict orders. Rest, medication, no stress. The orders were impossible to follow. He'd moved through the motions of recovery, physical therapy, cardiac follow-ups, the careful management of blood pressure medication. But his mind was elsewhere, obsessed with something that had been gnawing at him since his conversation with Jasmine about the Metropolitan Development Fund. He pulled files from his private office, papers he'd reviewed hundreds of times without truly seeing them. Investment portfolios, acquisition records, displacement reports carefully buried in footnotes. The language was clinical, sanitized, tenant relocation, market optimization, value extraction, translation, destroying neighborhoods and lives for profit. David began cross-referencing addresses. One by one, he recognized the pattern. The Metropolitan Development Fund didn't just displace people randomly. They targeted specific neighborhoods, areas with the largest populations of people of color, areas with weak tenant protections, areas where city officials could be persuaded to look the other way. He called his private investigator, Helen Chun, a woman who'd worked for him for a decade doing background checks on potential business partners. This time, he was asking her to investigate his own company. "What exactly are you looking for?" Helen asked over the encrypted video call, her expression cautious. "Proof of systematic discrimination," David said. "I want to know if the Metropolitan Development Fund deliberately targeted minority neighborhoods." Helen was silent for a long moment. "David, if what you're suggesting is true, this is serious. This isn't just unethical business practice. This could be illegal." "I know," David said. "That's why I need proof." Helen spent 10 days gathering documents. property acquisition records, census data, tenant demographics, city zoning decisions, campaign finance records showing donations to city officials who fast-tracked zoning changes in specific neighborhoods. When she presented her findings, they were damning. The Metropolitan Development Fund had acquired 247 buildings over the past 12 years, displacing 18,643 people. Of those buildings, 89% were in neighborhoods where the population was over 60% Black or Latino. The displacement had increased property values dramatically, and Meridian Financial's profits along with them. But there was more. Some of the files Helen uncovered showed internal communications. Emails from Nathaniel Torres to regional managers with subject lines like "Focus on minority neighborhoods," "Lower resistance," and "These communities won't fight back. Acquisition targets here." One email was particularly damning. "We're not displacing people. We're upgrading neighborhoods. The current residents can't afford the upgrades anyway. Problem solves itself." David felt physically ill. He'd signed off on these strategies. He'd approved these acquisitions. He'd attended board meetings where profit margins were discussed without acknowledging the human cost. "There's something else," Helen said quietly, pulling up another file. "Your CFO, Nathaniel Torres, personally owns 3 properties acquired through the Metropolitan Development Fund. He's made over $40 million from these acquisitions. So have 4 other board members." David's hands trembled as he absorbed the scope of what he was seeing. This wasn't just a company engaging in predatory practices. This was systematic theft disguised as business, enriching executives while destroying communities. He thought of Jasmine, forced into homelessness partly because of decisions he'd made, policies he'd approved, profit margins he'd prioritized. That night, unable to sleep, David made a decision. He contacted a journalist he knew from Columbia, Regina Washington, who worked for a major investigative news outlet. They arranged to meet in person at a coffee shop in Brooklyn, far from Midtown where someone might recognize him. Regina listened to everything: the files, the evidence, the systematic targeting of minority neighborhoods, the personal enrichment of board members. When David finished, she was quiet for a long time. "If this is real," Regina said carefully, "if you can provide documentation, this is a massive story. But you understand what happens next? Meridian Financial will fight. They'll hire the best lawyers in the country. They'll attack your credibility. They'll say you're having mental health issues after your heart attack, that you're confused, maybe even suggest this is revenge against the board for wanting you to take medical leave." "I know," David said. "And when they find out Jasmine was the catalyst, that she's homeless, that she has no permanent address or family connections, they'll go after her too. They'll try to discredit her, paint her as someone you're being manipulated by." David's jaw tightened. "They won't find her. She's disappeared." "They'll find her," Regina said with certainty. "And when they do, they'll destroy her reputation to protect theirs." David stood, pacing the small coffee shop. "So what do you suggest? That I stay quiet? That I protect myself by letting them keep destroying people like Jasmine?" Regina met his gaze steadily. "I'm suggesting you understand the cost before you choose this path. Because once you release this information, there's no taking it back. You'll lose your position, probably your fortune, at least some of it. And if Jasmine becomes part of this story, her life becomes public property." David thought of Jasmine disappearing to protect him, of her learning to be invisible as a survival mechanism, of her refusing to let herself take up space in the world because she'd been taught she didn't deserve to. "Find her," he told Regina. "We need her permission before we do anything. She deserves to know what's coming and choose whether to be part of it." "That's going to be difficult," Regina said. "She doesn't want to be found." "Then find me a way to reach her," David said. "Because this isn't my story to tell alone. She's the reason I'm seeing any of this at all." As David left the coffee shop, he didn't know that his decision to include Jasmine, to give her agency in what came next, would become the most important choice of his life. He didn't know yet that Jasmine had spent the past 2 weeks organizing with other homeless teenagers, documenting their experiences with predatory landlords, collecting stories that would become the foundation for everything that followed. They were both gathering evidence. Neither of them knew the other was doing it. The location was carefully chosen. A community center in East Harlem, far from the corporate towers of Midtown, in a neighborhood that had been a primary target of the Metropolitan Development Fund. The press conference had been scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, which gave journalists enough time to arrange coverage but not enough time for Meridian Financial to mount a preemptive strike. Jasmine stood backstage with David, neither of them quite believing they'd reached this point. She wore clothes that Regina had helped her pick out. Not expensive, but clean and dignified. David wore a simple button-down shirt instead of his usual suit. A deliberate choice to signal this wasn't about wealth or corporate posturing. "Last chance to back out," Regina said, checking her phone. "Meridian's legal team just filed a cease and desist. They're threatening defamation suits." "I know," David said. "That's how I know we're telling the truth." Jasmine squeezed his hand. Over the past week, since Regina had finally found her, Jasmine and David had met multiple times. She'd shared her story in detail, the specific building she'd lived in with her grandmother before displacement, the domino effect of losing housing, the cascade into homelessness. She'd connected it all to Meridian Financial's acquisition records. It matched perfectly. "Are you sure about this?" David asked her quietly. "I've been visible and invisible my whole life," Jasmine said. "I'm tired of hiding." They walked out onto the small stage. The room erupted with camera flashes and shouted questions. Regina stood to the side with her camera crew, ready to document what would become one of the most significant financial scandals of the decade. David stepped to the microphone. "My name is David Patterson. For 15 years, I served as Chief Operating Officer of Meridian Financial Holdings. I'm here today to publicly acknowledge that the company I helped lead has systematically targeted and displaced nearly 19,000 people from minority neighborhoods across the city. I helped design these strategies. I approved these acquisitions. I benefited financially from this destruction." The room exploded. Journalists shouted questions. David raised his hand for silence. "I'm not here to excuse what I did. I'm here because a 17-year-old girl I didn't know saved my life on a subway platform. When I thanked her, she didn't ask for money. She asked me to see her. And when I finally looked, really looked, I saw what my company had done to people like her." He gestured to Jasmine, who stepped forward. Jasmine's voice was steady as she spoke into the microphone. "My name is Jasmine Brooks. When I was 9 years old, I lived with my grandmother in a building on 119th Street. Meridian Financial bought that building in 2019. They raised the rent 40% in the first year. My grandmother couldn't afford it. We were evicted. She moved in with my aunt, then my aunt couldn't afford it either, and my grandmother ended up in a shelter. She died there 2 years ago. I've been homeless since I was 15. She held up a piece of paper. "This is the eviction notice. This building was purchased by Meridian Financial and sold 18 months later for $2.3 million profit. That profit went directly to executives of the company, including David Patterson, Nathaniel Torres, and for other board members." Regina's crew filmed as Jasmine laid out the documentation, not just her story, but the stories of 43 other families who had been displaced by the Metropolitan Development Fund. Photographs, eviction notices, rental increase records, proof of the systematic targeting of neighborhoods based on racial demographics. David presented Helen Chen's investigation findings, the emails from Nathaniel Torres, the census analysis, the property acquisition patterns, the personal enrichment of board members. "We're not just presenting these findings to the media," David said. "We're simultaneously filing a complaint with the New York State Attorney General's office and with the Federal Housing Administration. We're providing all documentation to law enforcement. And we're committing to a settlement fund for displaced families, funded by the personal assets of the executives involved." Before David could finish, security appeared at the back of the room. Meridian Financial's legal team had arrived in person, 3 sharp-suited attorneys with stern expressions and printed legal documents. One of them, Victoria Sinclair, stepped forward. "David Patterson, this press conference constitutes defamation, breach of fiduciary duty, and violation of corporate confidentiality agreements. You are hereby notified that Meridian Financial will be pursuing civil and potentially criminal charges. Everyone in this room is now complicit in that defamation if they report these unsubstantiated claims. Regina stood up immediately. Every claim is substantiated with documentation. We have copies available to the press. The legal team paused, reassessing. They'd expected bullying to work. They hadn't expected evidence. Victoria Sinclair's face hardened. This will be the most expensive mistake of your life, David. And this girl, she gestured dismissively at Jasmine, will become persona non grata in this city. By the time we're done, nobody will hire her, house her, or trust her. Jasmine stepped forward. Her voice was quiet but carried absolute clarity. I've been homeless since I was 15. I've slept on subway platforms and in shelters. I know what it's like to have nothing. You can't threaten me with what you've already taken from me. The room fell silent. Then the journalists erupted with questions again, this time directed at Victoria and the legal team, who realized too late that they'd just been filmed making threats on camera. By evening, the story had exploded across every news outlet. The headline trended nationally. Billionaire CEO exposes own company's housing discrimination scheme. Homeless teen's story sparks investigation. Meridian Financial's stock plummeted. Investors panicked. The phones at the New York State Attorney General's office were flooded with calls. But what nobody expected was what happened next. Within 24 hours, former employees of Meridian Financial started coming forward. Dozens of people who worked in acquisition and property management revealed they'd been directed to target minority neighborhoods. Some had quit in protest years ago. Others had stayed, rationalizing their participation, until they saw David and Jasmine's press conference and realized they couldn't stay silent anymore. The momentum had shifted irrevocably. The question was no longer whether Meridian Financial had engaged in discriminatory practices. The question was whether anyone involved would face criminal charges. As David watched the news coverage that evening, Jasmine beside him in his penthouse apartment, he realized something had fundamentally changed. He'd expected institutional resistance. He'd expected the board to fight back harder. What he hadn't expected was that once people began telling the truth, others would follow. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, investigators, lawyers, and observers filled every seat. At the center of the storm sat Judge Margaret Sullivan, a federal judge known for her no-nonsense approach to financial crimes. The case before her was unprecedented. The state of New York versus Meridian Financial Holdings and 8 individual executives. The charges included fair housing violations, systematic discrimination, and fraud against federal housing programs. Nathaniel Torres sat at the defendant's table, flanked by his legal team. His expression was carefully neutral, but his jaw was clenched tight. Victoria Sinclair sat 2 chairs away, her perfect posture the only thing holding her dignity together as cameras captured her arrival. The prosecution presented their case methodically. Regina Washington had published her full investigation, and every piece of documentation she'd presented at the press conference was now entered as evidence. Former employees testified about the neighborhood targeting directives they'd received. One regional manager broke down while describing how he'd been instructed to identify buildings with the highest concentration of Black residents and the weakest tenant protections. But the most damaging testimony came unexpectedly. David Patterson's own son, Tyler, requested to testify as a character witness, not for his father, but for the prosecution. The courtroom fell silent as the 18-year-old Columbia student took the stand, his voice steady as he explained how he'd confronted his father weeks earlier about Meridian Financial's practices, how his father had dismissed his concerns, how his father had only truly seen the problem when forced to acknowledge it through Jasmine's humanity. My father spent my entire childhood teaching me that profit was the ultimate measure of success, Tyler said. He missed my graduation from high school to close a deal. He wasn't at my mother's funeral because of a board meeting. And the only thing that finally made him understand the human cost of his decisions was a girl he didn't know saving his life on a subway platform. That's not a defense of his actions. That's an indictment of our entire system that it takes a near-death experience to develop a conscience. The courtroom was silent. David, sitting in the gallery behind the prosecution, had tears running down his face. Judge Sullivan called for a recess. Behind the scenes, Plea negotiations began immediately. Nathaniel Torres' legal team approached the prosecution with an offer. Torres would provide detailed testimony against the company's broader practices in exchange for a reduced sentence. He would implicate the board members who'd personally profited, document the specific neighborhoods targeted, and reveal which city officials had been paid to facilitate zoning changes. By the end of the day, Torres had flipped. His testimony would be the foundation for a much larger investigation into governmental corruption as well. Victoria Sinclair, however, refused to negotiate. She hired the most expensive legal team money could buy and announced she would fight every charge. She issued a statement claiming she was being scapegoated for decisions made by the entire company, that she bore no personal responsibility for acquisition strategies, that this was a witch hunt against a successful woman executive. The media tore her argument apart within hours. Her own emails, subpoenaed during discovery, showed she'd personally approved targeting strategies and had sent bonuses to regional managers with subject lines reading, "Great work on minority neighborhood acquisitions." 3 weeks into the trial, Meridian Financial's board voted to remove David Patterson's name from the company entirely. His decades of service were erased from corporate history. They issued a statement suggesting he was acting erratically due to his health crisis and medication side effects. A transparent attempt to discredit his testimony. David didn't fight it. He simply released a statement. "They can remove my name, but they cannot remove my responsibility. I'm not seeking redemption. I'm seeking accountability." Meanwhile, the Attorney General's office expanded the investigation into the city officials who'd facilitated the zoning changes. 3 city council members resigned before charges could be filed. One mayor's aide agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity. The investigation revealed a pattern. Meridian Financial had made strategic donations to politicians who then used their positions to expedite zoning changes in targeted neighborhoods. In some cases, rent-controlled buildings had been rezoned for commercial development specifically to displace long-term tenants and allow for gentrification. What had started as a case against one financial company was becoming a referendum on how wealth and political power intersected to destroy communities. The victim impact hearing. 3 months later, Jasmine sat in the courtroom witness box, facing Nathaniel Torres, who was now testifying against his own company as part of his plea deal. 43 displaced families sat behind her, the ones whose stories she'd collected, whose eviction notices she'd documented. Judge Sullivan asked Jasmine to describe the impact of displacement on her family. Jasmine spoke for 40 minutes. She described her grandmother's deteriorating health in the shelter. She described the cascade of loss, how losing one apartment meant losing stability, which meant losing school, which meant losing future opportunity. She described what it felt like to be invisible in a city where invisibility could kill you, literally and figuratively. When she finished, the courtroom was utterly silent. Judge Sullivan turned to Nathaniel Torres. "Do you have anything to say to the victims of your company's actions?" Torres hesitated, then spoke quietly. "No amount of words will make this right. I made decisions for profit. Those decisions destroyed lives. I was coward enough to think that it was business as usual. It wasn't. It was cruelty disguised as commerce." Victoria Sinclair refused to address the victims at all, maintaining her combative posture to the end. The verdict 3 months after the press conference. The verdicts came down. Nathaniel Torres, 12 years in federal prison, $45 million in restitution. Victoria Sinclair, 8 years in federal prison, $32 million in restitution. 3 other board members. Prison sentences ranging from 4 to 7 years. Meridian Financial Holdings was ordered to disband. Its assets were seized. A settlement fund of $200 million was established for displaced families. But more significantly, the investigation into municipal corruption resulted in criminal charges against 6 city officials and new zoning regulations designed to prevent the systematic targeting of minority neighborhoods through predatory real estate practices. As Jasmine watched the news coverage of the convictions, sitting beside David in the penthouse that would soon become something very different, she understood something profound. The system hadn't changed because one person became rich enough to fight it. The system had begun to change because a homeless girl had helped a stranger, and that stranger had finally chosen to see. The space that had once been a neglected municipal building was now fully renovated. Sunlight streamed through newly repaired windows. Tables were set up with computers, job training materials, GED study guides, and housing counseling resources. On the wall, a sign read, "The Jasmine Brooks Foundation for Housing Justice." Jasmine, now 18, stood at the podium wearing neither expensive clothes nor the tattered garments of homelessness. She wore simple jeans and a sweater, the uniform of someone who existed in the middle, grounded in both worlds but belonging fully to neither. Behind her sat David Patterson, no longer chief operating officer of anything, but now just a man learning to be useful. "When I was homeless, I thought I was alone," Jasmine began, her voice steady. "I thought homelessness was a personal failure, something I'd done wrong. What I didn't understand was that my homelessness wasn't an accident. It was engineered. It was designed by people in power who profited from my family's displacement." She gestured to the room filled with housing advocates, social workers, and formerly homeless individuals, the Foundation's first cohort of fellows. "This foundation exists to undo that engineering. We're not here to save people. We're here to dismantle the systems that create homelessness in the first place." The Foundation's first initiative had been establishing a legal defense fund for tenants facing unjust evictions. The second was a comprehensive data project documenting every predatory real estate practice in the city. The third was a fellowship program that trained formerly homeless people as housing advocates and policy experts. David had contributed his financial settlement, approximately $60 million after legal fees, to fund the work for the next 20 years. But more importantly, he'd signed away his board memberships, his consulting roles, his positions of power. He was now working as the Foundation's operations director, a role that paid a modest salary and required him to be in the office every day. His son Tyler, having taken a year off from Columbia, was working as the Foundation's youth engagement coordinator. The estrangement between father and son had transformed into something more complicated. Not quite reconciliation, but genuine collaboration grounded in shared purpose rather than obligation. Meanwhile, across the city, the changes rippling from the case extended far beyond Meridian Financial. The city's Department of Housing had been restructured after the scandal. A new director, Patricia Okonkwo, had been appointed, a housing rights advocate with a track record of challenging gentrification. She'd immediately begun reversing the zoning changes that had facilitated Meridian Financial's predatory practices. 7 neighborhoods had been redesignated as rent-protected zones, preventing future speculative development. Building-by-building rent controls had been reinstated in areas that had experienced rapid displacement. And most significantly, a new city ordinance required impact assessments on minority communities before any major real estate acquisition could be approved. The changes didn't solve homelessness, but they created friction in a system that had operated frictionlessly for too long. The question of redemption. One evening, in the Foundation's offices after hours, Jasmine and David sat across from each other at a simple desk. No penthouse view, no markers of wealth. Just 2 people in a small room with walls covered in photographs of families who'd been displaced and then rehoused. "Do you feel redeemed?" Jasmine asked, not unkindly. David considered the question seriously. "No, and I don't think I should be. Redemption is for people who've done something wrong and then faced consequences. I faced consequences, yes, but I'm not redeemed. I'm just trying to do better." "That's good," Jasmine said, "because redemption suggests you get to move on. This work doesn't move on. It just keeps going." "Is that exhausting?" David asked. "Sometimes," Jasmine admitted, "but less exhausting than being invisible. Less exhausting than knowing there's a system designed to crush you and pretending it's your fault." 1 year later, Jasmine had started college, CUNY, paid for through the settlement fund. She was studying urban planning with a focus on housing policy. She split her time between classes and working as the Foundation's research director. David had been approached multiple times by companies wanting to hire him, offering 7-figure salaries to leverage his business expertise. He'd declined all of them. He'd also been approached by journalists wanting to write his redemption story, the billionaire who saw the light. He'd declined those invitations too. Instead, He lived in a modest apartment in Brooklyn with his son. He worked 50-hour weeks for a modest salary. He attended community board meetings. He listened more than he talked. The real ending. One afternoon, Jasmine was sitting in the foundation's office when a young girl, perhaps 12 years old, walked in with her mother. The girl had been living in a shelter with her family for the past 3 months after their building was sold and they couldn't afford the new rent. The mother approached Jasmine hesitantly. "Are you the girl from the news? The one who helped expose Meridian Financial?" Jasmine nodded. "I want my daughter to know," the mother said, "that when she sees something wrong, she doesn't have to accept it. She can do something about it." The girl looked at Jasmine with wonder. "Did you really live on the street?" "I did," Jasmine said. "And now I work to make sure as few people as possible have to." "That's cool," the girl said simply. Later, David asked Jasmine how the interaction made her feel. "Like the work matters," Jasmine said. "Not because I'm special or heroic, but because systems can change when enough people decide to see them for what they are." David nodded, understanding finally what had taken him a lifetime to learn, that the real change doesn't come from one person's grand gesture of sacrifice. It comes from consistent, unglamorous work of building something better, day after day, with people who refuse to accept that injustice is inevitable. The closing truth. As the city moved forward, Jasmine's story became something different from what the media had initially portrayed. It wasn't a redemption arc for a billionaire. It was a story about visibility, about a girl who refused to be invisible, and what happens when someone with power finally chooses to see. The Metropolitan Development Fund was gone. Nathaniel Torres and Victoria Sinclair were in federal prison. Municipal corruption had been exposed. Zoning protections had been strengthened. But more than that, a system had been forced to acknowledge what it had been doing. And once seen, it couldn't be unseen. Jasmine stood in the foundation's office on the 1-year anniversary of the press conference, looking at the wall of photographs representing families now stably housed, children now in schools instead of shelters, futures now possible instead of foreclosed. She thought about the subway platform where she'd helped a stranger, where she'd made a choice that no one would have blamed her for not making. She thought about how that single act of compassion had rippled outward, exposing systems, changing laws, creating opportunities. But she also understood something the media never quite captured. She hadn't changed the system. The system had been designed by people like David Patterson, and it had taken people like him finally choosing to dismantle it. Her role had been to be the mirror, to show him what his choices looked like when reflected in the face of someone who'd lost everything. In the end, that was the real story. Not that helping a stranger could change your life, but that seeing someone you'd been trained not to see could change everything.